بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ونبينا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد، وبالسند المتصل منا إلى الإمام الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى قال: حدثنا سفيان بن وكيع قال حدثنا جميع بن عمر بن عبد الرحمن العجلي املأنا علينا من كتابه قال: أخبرني رجل من بني تميم من ولد أبي هالة زوج خديجة رضي الله عنها يكنى أبا عبد الله عن ابن لأبي هالة عن الحسن بن علي رضي الله عنه قال: سألت خالي هند بن أبي هالة وكان وصافا عن حلية رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Continuing with our next hadith, this hadith contains some very, very important people. First and foremost, Hassan bin Ali radiallahu anhu. This is one of the more detailed ahadith yet. We read one from Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu last week, and this one is by Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anha's son, which was the stepbrother of Hazrat Fatima radiallahu anha, who was the mother of Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu. In which Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu, he mentions, I asked my uncle Hind bin Abi Hala radiallahu anhu about the noble features of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the physical description of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he mentions, وَأَنَا أَشْتَهِي أَن يَصِفَ لِي مِنْهَا شَيْئًا أَتَعَلَّقُ بِهِ. He says, I felt that I should hear from him personally some of the physical features of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so I could make his description a part of my life and apply it to myself and try to adapt as much as possible and memorize them and emulate the lifestyle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in himself. This is very important because obviously Hassan radiallahu anhu, coming from a royal family, belonging to the family of the beloved daughter, the most beloved daughter of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the eldest son of Ali radiallahu anhu, the fourth Khalifa, coming from a family that was considered the most elite, but even having such high status, but yet Hassan radiallahu anhu, over and over, he is, even though he grew up in the lap of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yet he wanted to learn so that way he can adopt the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hazrat Hassan bin Ali radiallahu anhu, even though he saw Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he was born in the 3rd Hijri. According to most authentic narration, he was born in the 3rd Hijri. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, he was only at the tender age of 7 years. Because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated at the age of 50, and when Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu was born, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was at the age 53, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated at the age of 53, and 3 years later, Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu was born, and 7 years later, at the age of 63, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. So Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu was only 7 years of age. And obviously you can't fully capture the physical attributes of any person at that tender age, and this is the reason why Hazrat Hassan radiallahu anhu is asking his uncle, which is his maternal uncle, to describe some of the physical features of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one of the key attributes that he mentions is وَكَانَ وَصَّافًا. that my uncle was a wassaaf. Now, wassaaf is a person who is very talented at describing the details of something. A person who's very talented at describing the details of something. So, Hadith Hind bin Abi Hala radiyallahu anhu was very keen on describing the physical features of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because if you look at this, it's very easy for Hadith Hasan radiyallahu anhu to ask his own father, Hadith Ali radiyallahu anhu. But he actually made an attempt to ask Hadith Hind bin Abi Hala radiyallahu anhu. And the main reason why was because he was a wassaaf, a person who was talented in describing the physical features of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. فقال, his uncle describes, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فخما مفخما. His uncle describes the noble features of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam by saying, he was magnificent in himself, meaning he himself had many attributes that made him magnificent in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also mufakhama is just another way of saying that he was not only magnificent in himself, but also greatly considered magnificent amongst other people. So not only that he was great, but also he was great and magnificent in the eyes of other people. يَتَلَأْلَأُ وَجْهُهُ تَلَأْلُؤَ الْقَمَرِ لَيْلَةَ الْبَدْرِ. His blessed face would radiate like the full moon. It would illuminate like the full moon. Initially, I was going to talk about this. We kind of touch bases with this wording that a lot of the Arab, they used to give examples with nature. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a lot of places in the Quran actually gave examples of different natural things, because this was commonly used amongst the Arab to give examples. And this is why in this specific saying, he mentions the example of the full moon. And there is another narration that's coming, inshallah. We will talk in detail about that over there. He continues and he says, أطول من المربوع وأقصر من المشذب. He was slightly taller than an average person, a person with an average and a moderate height. He was slightly taller than an average person, a moderate person, yet shorter than an extremely tall person. And we talked about the height of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in great detail in the past hadith, that he was not very tall and he was not very short. But yet, he was of moderate stature and he was of a moderate height, that any person would feel that he had a height that is to be loved. Azim al-Hamma. His blessed head was moderately large. And we talked about this in the previous session. Rajul al-Sha'r. His blessed hair was slightly wavy. We talked in great detail about the characteristics of his beloved hair, and that was that it was mainly straight with a slight wave to it. And as I mentioned earlier, that inshallah there is an entire chapter coming in regards to the length of the hair of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inshallah, we will go into detail as far as the length is concerned in those ahadith and in that chapter. And he continues to say, إن انفرقت عقيقته فرقها وإلا فلا. That if his hair became parted naturally, he would part it. Otherwise, he would not habitually make an effort to part his hair. As I mentioned that inshallah, this will also come in those chapters about the parting of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hair. Because it was a tradition of the mushrikeen at that time to put it in the back or to part it. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tried to adapt it one way, and he was instructed to adapt another way. Inshallah, we'll go into that detail later. But the one thing that a lot of the commentators highlighted at this point was that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would naturally part his hair. But after a certain time passes, obviously when initially after showering or oiling and combing of his hair, all those chapters are coming inshallah, his hair was parted very harshly. But after some time goes by, and after a few moments go by, the partition would obviously collapse, and you will see that the hair is not exactly in line anymore. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not habitually make a habit to always sharply part his hair. So this is one of the attributes of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he was free from any takalluf. He did not want to be, he did not want to have a physical, specific appearance in the people. No, obviously he would make an attempt to part his hair, but when the parting collapsed and it wasn't exactly straight, he left it. He did not make an extra effort to make sure that he always kept a comb on himself to make sure that it was exactly parted. So inshallah, as far as the parting and not parting of the hair, we'll go into the detail when the chapter comes for that. Going on, he mentions, لا يجاوز شعره شحمة أذنيه إذا هو وفره. When the hair of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was abundant, was a lot, he used to pass over his earlobes. Again, this is containing the height of the hair of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the length of the hair of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inshallah, we'll go into the detail in a specific chapter. Moving on, azharul lawn. Azharul lawn is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a very luminous complexion. And we talked about this when we talked about asmarul lawn, that Rasulullah there was one sahabi, Anas radiallahu anh, he mentioned asmarul lawn, and there was 15 other narrations from different narrators that mentioned azharul lawn. And this is one of those where his complexion was illuminated, and it was of luminous complexion. Wasi'ul jabin. Wasi'ul jabin translates to his forehead was wide. And obviously, this is a sign of a person that has a very broad face. And we talked about the face of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the previous hadith. And jabin doesn't only refer to the forehead. That's jabha. This portion is considered jabha. But the portion that is on top of your temples, that's considered jabin. So not only that he had a wide forelock, but also an entire wide forehead, meaning his entire front of the face was bare with hair. He did not have any hair in the entire front portion, as well as on top of his temples. Azajjul hawajib. This is describing the eyebrows of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the previous hadith, we talked about the eyelashes, but we did not talk about, it did not mention anything about the eyebrows. In this specific narration, he mentions azajjul hawajib. Now in azaj, in qamus, which is a dictionary, it mentions azaj has 3 meanings. Azaj has 3 meanings. Number 1 is taqawwusul fil hajib, that it's as if it was a bow, meaning it was perfectly bowed, with the perfect shape of a bow. Number 2, ma'atulihi, and it was long, and it was thin. It was the shape of a bow, it was long, and it was thin. This is the most beautiful eyebrows that you can possibly imagine. And if you see now that any person who messes with the eyebrows, even though it is prohibited for men and women to mess with the hair of the eyebrows, but anytime you will see, this is exactly what they're trying to emulate, the eyebrows of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Thin, long, and perfectly shaped of the eye, which is like a bow. So these are the 3 characteristics. And he continues to describe, and he says, sawabigha fi ghayri qarnin, that it was not connected. It was thick, meaning he had a lot of hair, abundance of hair, just like his eyelashes, but it was not connected in the middle. because obviously being connected, it's not the very best thing. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to not have his eyebrows connected. So they were separated in the middle. So every eyebrow was separate on his side. And then he goes on to say, بَيْنَهُمَا عِرْقٌ يُدِرُّهُ الْغَضَبُ. There was a vein between them that used to expand and protrude when he was angered. There was a vein that used to protrude when he would be angered, when he would become angry. First of all, the vein to protrude itself is a sign of strength. Anytime you see any person that has veins protruding any part of his body, that is a sign of strength. Secondly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam being angry. That itself is something that, a lot of times we might seem like being the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he shouldn't be angry. But the reality is that this is one of those emotions that is mandatory to maintain leadership and order. This is mandatory. If a person cannot get angry, he can never ever be a leader and he can never ever maintain order. He can never defend himself. He can never defend his values. And this is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions very, very clearly mentioned. He never ever took any revenge for himself. But at the same time, no one dared to even propose compromising the values of Sharia. So this is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would only become angry if any value of Sharia, any order of Sharia was compromised. And then he goes on to mention, أَعْنَى الْعِرْنَيْنِ لَهُ نُورٌ يَعْلُوهُ يَحْسَبُهُ مَنْ لَمْ يَتَأَمَّهُ أَشَمْ. His nose was prominent and had a light that would disseminate from it. And also, upon the first glance, if a person would not look carefully, he would think as if his nose is slightly large. So obviously, having a larger nose is not something that is preferred in men or women. So a lot of the commentators, they mention the reason for this. And when they go into the lugha, they go into the linguistic part of this description, they mention that a'na actually means that when it comes in describing the nose, it means to have the bone be flat and thin. The actual bone to be flat and thin. But this portion of it used to kind of look long. The bottom portion of the nose used to kind of look long. And then they mention the reason why, which is also mentioned in this hadith, is lahu nurun ya'luhu. That he would have light come from it. We know Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's face was always illuminated. He had a very luminous complexion. So we know that it was always light. And the beauty of the tip of the nose is exactly centered of the entire face. So when you look at anything that is bright, the brightest portion is the middle of it. If you look at a light bulb, the brightest portion of it would be the middle. So this is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have light, have a very luminous complexion, and this is why his tip of his nose used to slightly look big. But immediately he mentioned that if a person would look at him at first glance, he would think that his nose was slightly large and protruding, but in reality it was not like that. After pondering and after being acquainted in his company, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's nose was perfect. Moving on, he mentions Kathul Lihya. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's beard was full and dense. And we know that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never trimmed his beard so small that it would not be considered dense. He had a lot of hair, as we know, even on his head, on his beard, his eyebrows, his eyelashes, he had a lot of dense hair. And we talked about this in detail in the first chapter in regards to one is having thick hair or thin hair. And one is having the amount of hair. So there's two different characteristics which describe the hair of a person. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not have thick hair. He had a lot of hair. As we know from the eyelashes, the eyebrows, the head. Similarly, he had a lot of hair on his beard. And this is why it comes in the hadith that whenever he would rinse his face in wudu, he would also do khilal of his beard. The reason is because it was so dense that he had to pass his fingers through to make sure that he does proper khilal. Sahlul Khaddain. He goes on to mention the cheeks of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sahl actually means to be soft and even and to be flat. To be soft, to be even, and do not have anything protruding. So there was no extra flesh. We talked about this, that there was no extra flesh protruding from his cheeks. Obviously, that's a sign of an unhealthy person. So that's why it was flat and it was smooth. There was nothing that would make it uneven. He was smooth. And similarly, his hands and his feet were also smooth. That's coming also in the later part of this hadith. So his cheeks were soft, even, and nothing was protruding from it. And it's very flat. Dali'ul fam. His mouth was wide. Now, the reason why this is specifically mentioned about his mouth is whenever a person has a small mouth, the teeth can't grow properly. Immediately, that becomes a problem. So when you have a small mouth, Dennis can tell us that when you have a small mouth, the teeth cannot come out properly, and because of that, they start overlapping. And when the other teeth start coming, they start pushing the other teeth, and it would make sure that the entire row of the teeth is disturbed. Secondly, when you have a small mouth or uneven teeth, your pronunciation gets affected. And we know Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's pronunciation was perfect. When he used to recite the Quran, his pronunciation of every letter, every attribute of every letter was pronounced perfectly. So this was one of the things that when you have a wide mouth, you have correct pronunciation of words. Secondly, a person he's considered very eloquent in speech. That when he is explaining something, he's able to describe it because certain words have certain powers in speech in itself. This is obviously, if you study the depth of rhetoric and different words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam choose to use in Quran and Hadith, just the word itself has so much power to it. And different letters of the Quran, different letters of the Arabic language have different powers that can deliver the message in a different manner. And also, when a person has a wider mouth, he is considered to have talent in communication. And anytime he is communicating with another person, he's able to deliver his message across to the other person very perfectly. Then he goes on to mention the characteristics of his teeth, and he mentions muflajul asnan. He had a slight gap in the front two teeth. Sometimes the mufassirin, the muhaddithin, they mention it was only in the front two teeth. But there's a lot of commentators who mention that it wasn't just in the front two teeth. In the front two teeth, there was a little extra, but in all of them, they were slightly gapped. Just the way, if you look at an example of a perfect line of teeth, you will see that if a person is very keen on the upkeep of his teeth, you will know that if you're a habitual flosser, you will know that the floss would actually create a slight gap between the teeth, and that is exactly when they're lined perfectly. And this is exactly what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had. And we know Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not have a habit of laughing. He would only smile. And whenever he would smile, the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in will capture his front teeth. So this is just talking about his front teeth had gaps. But again, the commentators mentioned that it wasn't just his front teeth. His front two teeth had a little extra gap, but the rest of the teeth also had a slight gap, which made the lineup perfect. Moving on, he mentions daqiqul masraba. Daqiq al-masraba it translates, which we talked about in the previous sessions. There was a thin line of hair from his chest to his navel. There was a thin line of hair from his chest to his navel. And then he talks about كَأَنَّ عُنُقَهُ جِيدُ دُمْيَةٍ فِي صِفَاءِ الْفِضَّةِ. His neck was of such a stature that it was as if a neck of a statue forged out of pure clean silver. Pure clean silver. And the commentators actually captured this ibarah, this specific wording, and they go into the detail as to why he mentioned a statue and why he mentioned silver and why he mentioned the neck and not any other body part. So, first and foremost, he mentioned a statue because you have the ability to forge whatever you want. Whenever you are forging something, you can make whatever you want, whatever shape you want out of it. And this is the reason why he used this example here. That, just like a statue, if you say the neck it looks better when it's a little thin, maybe it's a little flat from the back, maybe it's a little protruding from the front, so on and so forth. You can exactly carve it and forge it how you want. So this is the reason why he used the example of a statue. Secondly, he used silver because that was considered one of the elite substances for forging statues. And obviously we know that clean silver holds a lot of great value. And then, why did he mention the neck? Even though all of the body parts of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam were amazing, were as if they were forged out of pure silver. But why did he mention the neck? The reason is because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's most beautiful part of his body was his face and his head. The most beautiful part of anyone's body, a person that loves his body part the most, is his face. He would make sure that his face is looking the best out of his entire body. So, obviously, when you're displaying the most beautiful thing, the stand that you're putting it on has to be just as beautiful. And this is why he mentions that his neck was as if it was forged out of pure silver, so it can display the luminous face of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And also, the reason why he mentioned safa al-fidda, clean neck. Obviously, we know that a person, even when a person who spends a lot of his time in the sun, we'll know he would be tan. But many times we would make an attempt to make sure that our face doesn't get tan, but our neck is always more tan than our face. And also, we would make sure that there was no dirt on our face, but obviously on the neck, there's always there would be a little, like if you're working and you're sweating, you would wipe the sweat off of your face and you'll wash your face first rather than your neck. So the neck is the area where it's less clean than the face or any other part. So this is why he mentioned that even the neck of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was very, very pure and it was very clean at all times, as if it was pure silver. Just the way silver lights up, that's the way his neck used to light up. He goes on to mention mu'tadilul khalq. All of his body parts were proportionate to one another. I'tidal, we know i'tidal means to be moderate, to be in the middle. So mu'tadilul khalq, that his nature, his entire body, his physique was moderately distributed and very proportionate to one another. If a person has even one body part that is bigger than the rest of it, things will look out of proportionate. So that's why he specifically mentioned that all these things are there and everything was in proportion to one another. Badinun mutamasikun. he was neither extremely plump nor extremely skinny. Talking about his body weight, he was neither very obese or plump or had extra body fat, and neither he was very skinny. He had a very moderate stature. And then he goes on to explain, sawa'ul batni was sadr. His stomach and his chest were aligned. His stomach and his chest were aligned. And then he says, aridu sadr, but his chest was broad. As we know, that's a sign of strength. I wanted to just point out a few points here. We're facing a very big dilemma here in our country with the rising obesity rates, and it's rocket high to the extent that 35% of entire America is obese. Not even just overweight, but rather obese. There are over 100,000 deaths a year just for obesity. Just for obesity. And the society spends almost $117 billion to tackle obesity directly or indirectly and tackle the diseases related to obesity. The reason why I'm mentioning this, Shaykh al-Hadith rahimahullah, he dedicated over 100 pages in his Fadail al-Sadaqat about not eating too much. And Hazrat Luqman alayhi salam used to always advise his son that it is better to feed your food to a dog than to eat it while your stomach is full. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentions that the worst of vessels a person can fill, is his stomach. And we know Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The reason why I'm mentioning this, a lot of times we choose to blame our genetics, and we say, it just runs in my family, hereditary. It just comes, or I cannot help. It's an issue. It's a disease. But in reality, a lot of these numbers are related to social and cultural eating habits. If we get together, we feel that we have to eat. And this is one of the reasons why I like to bring this up, is because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was very keen on making sure he trained the Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in not to overeat. And he always wanted to eat one day so he can be thankful, and starve the next day so he can do sabr. A person goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, brother, you need to lose your weight. You need to bring that weight down a little bit. He says, no, doctor, obesity runs in my family. So he tried to blame his genetics and genes, and he said, obesity runs in my family. So the doctor replies, saying, no one runs in your family. This is the reason why we're facing this issue. No one runs in your family. Anyways, moving on to the next sentence, he mentions بَعِيدُ مَا بَيْنَ الْمَنْكِبَيْنِ, that his shoulders were broad. And we talked about this in the previous hadith. ضَخْمُ الْكَرَادِيسِ, the bones of his joints were large. This has also been discussed. أَنْوَرُ الْمُتَجَرَّدِ. أَنْوَرُ الْمُتَجَرَّدِ, I have translated here that his body was radiant. Mutajarrad actually is debated amongst the translators and the commentators of the hadith, that mutajarrad can mean both the body parts that were exposed or the body parts that were covered. So some of the commentators mentioned that those body parts that were exposed would shine, and obviously those are covered, they would not be radiant. But some of the commentators said the opposite, that those body parts that would be open, that would not be covered, they would be tan, and that is why he didn't have as much luminance in those body parts than the body parts that used to be covered. So those body parts used to shine more. Nevertheless, we would just translate it as his body was very radiant and he had a luster to it. موصول ما بين اللبة والسرة بشعر يجري كالخط عاري الثديين والبطن مما سوى ذلك أشعر الذراعين والمنكبين وأعالي الصدر. This is all talking about the upper body of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as far as hair was concerned. Between the chest of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the navel, there was a thin line of hair. And then he's mentioning yajri kal khat. We talked about this last week also, that it ran like a line, as if somebody had pencils drawn it. We talked about this last week, that it was as if somebody had drawn it. And labba actually means right below the Adam's apple. It's basically where your chest starts, the top part of your chest. So from there, it went all the way down to his navel. From his upper chest, all the way down to his navel. And yajri kal khat, as it was pencil drawn. But then he goes on and he says, عَارِيَ الثَّدْيَيْنِ وَالْبَطَنِ مِمَّا سِوَى ذَلِكَ. That besides that line, the chest nor the stomach had any hair on it. The rest of the chest and the stomach did not have any hair. But he goes on to mention that obviously being hairless is something not admired for men. So he goes on to mention that أَشْعَرُ الذِّرَاعَيْنِ وَالْمَنْكَبَيْنِ وَأَعَالِيَ الصَّدْرِ. That his forearms, his shoulders, and the upper portion of his chest, the very upper portion of his chest, his forearms and his shoulders had hair. So the rest of his back and his lower stomach did not have any hair, but his upper chest and his shoulders and his arm had hair. رَحْبُ الرَّاحَةِ طَوِيلُ الزَّنْدَيْنِ. His forearms were big, were wide. رَحْبُ الرَّاحَةِ. His palms were wide. شَأْنُ الْكَفَّيْنِ وَالْقَدَمَيْنِ. The palms and the soles of both feet were fully fleshed. And we talked about this in the previous hadith, that his forearms and palms were wide, and these are again signs of strength, that a person who does his own work and a person who has a lot of strength in his body, his forearms and his hands would be wide. And then we know that his palms of both of his hands and the soles of both of his feet were fully fleshed. Then he goes on to mention سائل الأطراف أو قال الشائل الأطراف. His fingers and toes were moderately long. They weren't short. As we know that his palms were big. So short fingers would actually not be so attractive. This is why, just so that it's proportionate to his hand, his fingers were also kind of long. And this is very nice of our muhaddithin to preserve anything that could possibly be said. So over here, he mentions sa'ilul atraf, and then immediately after he said, or أو قال الشائل الأطراف. Even though it has the same meaning, sa'il and sha'il have very similar meaning, but he also mentioned that he might have said sa'ilul atraf, or he might have said sha'ilul atraf. And they wanted to clarify that later on, if somebody was to say, no, this is not what came to me, they would be able to confirm it, that is a sa'ilul or sha'ilul atraf. Then he mentions khamsanul akhmasain. Khamsanul akhmasain means that his soles were arched properly. As we know that there is a big problem amongst a lot of the children and even adults, that sometimes the sole not being arched, it causes problems in walking. And it's considered a problem in walking and carrying the body weight. So having that arch actually helps. And now there's thousands and thousands of dollars spent in researching that arch to make sure that the arch is proper. And a lot of the soles that we find in the market now is to cater to that arch. That if someone's arch is not proper, they fill in that area to make sure that the arch takes a perfect shape, so the walking and bearing the weight of the entire body is easy on that person. So the arch of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's sole was perfect. Masihul qadamain. His feet were smooth. And we talked about this, that masih actually means not only smooth, but it means soft, smooth, and also even. So it did not have any ups and downs. It did not have any dry skin. And it was very, very smooth, and it was very, very soft. To the extent, he describes that when he would wash it, يَنْبُو عَنْهُمَ الْمَاءِ, that whenever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would pour water on it, the water would flow away smoothly. The water would flow away very smoothly. And not cling onto his his feet. As we know that if a person has dry skin or if he has unevenness in his feet or hands, he would have to rub it. To the extent that Imam Malik rahimahullah says that in wudu, scrubbing is also, rubbing and scrubbing the skin is also part of the fara'id. He says that just the way when it's cold and we pour water, the water just touches our skin and goes away. He says the wudu would be invalid. You will have to rub it. So this is, the reason is because when the water is not flowing smoothly, you will have to make sure it gets all over your feet. And then towards the end, he talks about the walk of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a little bit more detail than we discussed in the previous hadith. إِذَا زَالَ زَالَ قَلِعًا يَخْتُو تَكَفِّيًا وَيَمْشِي هَوْنًا ذَرِيعُ الْمَشْيَةِ إِذَا مَشَاكَ أَنَّمَا يَنْحَطُ مِنْ صَبَبٍ. When he would walk, he lifted his feet very sternly. And then he mentions lightly leaning forward. And when he would lift them, zala qal'an. Qal'an actually means as if, if a person is plucking the weed from his garden. That's the qal'a is actually used for plucking. So obviously we know in plucking is as if you are lifting your foot with a lot of power. We know, we talked about this in detail, masha bi quwwa. He walked with a lot of power. So whenever he would lift his feet, he would not drag it. He would lift it up very sternly and he would pick it up with power. But when he would place it down, وَيَمْشِي هَوْنًا, he would place it down back on the ground very softly. And we know that's one of the attributes of Ibadur Rahman that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran that وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا. Those who, the dear servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are those who walk on the earth very softly. And this is the attribute of the walk of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. ذَرِيعُ الْمِشْيَةِ, he walked at a fast pace. We talked about this, but some of the mufassirin actually muhaddithin talked about this as having a long step and a long stride. He had just naturally, because he was just a bigger person, he had a natural long stride, that his steps would be further apart, not small steps. And this is something very preferred for men. إِذَا مَشَاكَ أَنَّمَا يَنْحَطُ مِنْ سَبَبٍ. When he walked, it seemed as if he was descending from an elevated place. We discussed this in detail. Also, وَإِذَا الْتَفَتَ جَمِيعًا. When he would direct his attention to anyone, when he would talk to anyone or direct his attention towards anything, he would turn his entire body. He would not just turn his face. And we talked about this, that this is an attribute of humility, and this is a way of fully giving your attention to someone. خافض الطرف نظره إلى الأرض أطول من نظره إلى السماء. He always kept his gaze low. And we know any modest person, he has a habit of lowering his gaze. And this is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that the worst place to walk on this earth is the aswaq, the marketplaces. And the reason being is because it's very hard to control your gaze. You don't know what you're going to encounter, so on and so forth. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's habit was always to look down. And then he goes on to mention, نَظْرُهُ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ أَطْوَلُ مِنْ نَظْرِهِ إِلَى السَّمَاءِ. That his sight would be towards the ground more than it would be towards the sky. That he would look down more than he would look up. Obviously, there's other narrations and a Quran ayah which kind of contradicts to this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Baqarah, قَدْ نَرَى وَجْهُكَ تَقَلُّبَ فِي السَّمَاءِ. That we see your face turn towards the sky. And in another hadith of Abu Dawud, it mentions that كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا جلس يتحدث يكثر أن يرفع طرفه إلى السماء. That whenever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would sit and talk to us, he would look a lot at the sky. So to reconcile between the two narrations, the muhaddithin mentioned that one was that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to look up while he was sitting. And this is exactly what the Quran ayah is referring to, as well as the hadith is referring to. That while sitting, he would look up. But also, the other narrations mention that he would look up when he would be waiting for Hazrat Jibreel alayhi salam to come. So immediately, when a person would ask a question, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not know the answer, he would immediately be silent. And right then, Jibreel alayhi salam would descend, and he would bring the revelation to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for the answer that he was asked. So this is the reason why he would look up at the sky. Otherwise, as any modest person, he would look at the ground as much as possible. Moving on, he mentions Julla nadhurihi al-mulahida. His gaze was mostly a glance. Obviously, looking at the wording, it seems that it's contradicting the first part, which says وَإِذَا إِلْتَفَتَ إِلْتَفَتَ مَعًا, that when he would direct his attention to someone, he would turn his entire body. Where this is saying that he would just glance at things. So when he would actually address anyone, and he would want to look at something, he would turn his entire body. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made sure that his glance never went on anything that he did not want to see. So every time he would look, he would just look and he would turn away. Until he wanted to address something, then he would turn his entire body and address that. And the reason the commentators went into the detail of this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a very, very soft and very sensitive personality. And we know that anytime we see something, there is an imprint on our mind for that thing. So if you see something disturbing, why is it that we can't fall asleep? Because we have taken that image and took an imprint of it on our mind, and that is why it's bothering us. So similarly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not want to see anything which would disturb him. To the extent that we know sometimes Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would finish a salah and he would turn around and he says that I did not like a certain cloth because it had some kind of design on it. And he mentioned that this would bother me in salah. Even though it wasn't a design, it wasn't a picture or it wasn't a map, it was just designs. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, this would bother me. And so once he wore a piece of cloth, which was a little higher than what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted, and he mentioned the same thing, that this became a source of distraction. And this is why i'tikaf is very popular, and one of the main things in Sharia, the reason and the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is because to disconnect us from all those things, to make sure that our mind is free from all of those things, so we can fully concentrate with the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he ends off with the hadith, with the sentence, يَسُوقُ أَصْحَابَهُ وَيَبْدَأُ مَنْ لَقِيَ بِالسَّلَامِ. He would walk behind his companions. The reason why he would walk behind his companions is because all the kings, they had the habit and the tradition of that time that king would walk in front and the entire army and everybody, the royal army, would walk behind the king. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did the entire opposite. This is one of the explanation that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not only that he walked with his companion, but he walked behind the companions. Secondly, this was obviously when he's walking with the Sahaba is usually while they were traveling. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to stay all the way in the back, and the people who would stay in the back are those who are weak and women. These are the people who would normally be in the back. So he wanted to make sure that everybody is doing okay, and he wanted to keep an eye on everyone. So this is the reason why he stayed behind the entire group of Sahaba. But there is a hadith that talks about the reason of why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stayed behind the Sahaba, and there is a Quranic verse that testifies to that, and which is Allah subhanahu wa taala mentions wal malaikatu ba'da dhalika dhahir, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would tell his companions that leave the area behind me free. And he used to walk in front of them, وَيَدَعُونَ ظَهْرَهُ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ, and he would leave the area behind him free for the malaika to follow. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ ظَهِيرٌ, that the malaika is also behind his back. as a form of protection. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as being the aid of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then Jibreel, and then Salihul Mu'mineen, and then he mentioned wal malaikatu ba'da dhalika dhahir. Then also the angels are behind him for his protection. And this is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the reasons why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would walk behind his companions. And the last sentence is وَيَبْدَأُ أَوْ قَالَ يَبْدَرُ مَنْ لَقِيَ بِالسَّلَامِ. In some narrations it says يَبْدَأُ, and in some narrations it says يَبْدَرُ. And يَبْدَأُ actually means to begin. Bada'a ibtida actually means to begin. So he would always be the one who would begin. He would always be the first one to offer salam. And يَبْدَرُ, badara means to hasten towards it. So both of them mean the same, that whenever he would approach anyone, he would be the first one to offer salam, and he would hasten towards it to make sure that he's the first one to offer salam. And the reason he himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned in the hadith that inna awla an-nas billahi ta'ala man mad'ahum bis-salam, that the person dearest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one who starts with the salam. And in another hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions al-badi'u bis-salami bari'un min al-kibr. A person who starts with the salam, he is free from any kind of arrogance. So, starting with the salam is a sign that you are free from arrogance. Or if you continue to habitually make salam first, then arrogance will would become a remedy for our arrogance. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to act upon the beautiful characteristics of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and may Allah give us the ability to adopt as much as we learn about the beloved Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
مولاي صل وسلم